Hey there, welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel, and I was looking at this guy, which is the first edition Dungeon Master's Player's Handbook, I should say. Recently, there's been a bunch of videos where people have kind of, mostly about alignment, interestingly enough, but they've been kind of like looking at some of the old books, so I busted out my Player's Handbook to look at it. As you probably know, if you watch this channel, I am much more of a BX person than I am an AD&D person, although we played a lot of AD&D. And I've talked about several times how the idea that, sometimes people have this like misconception how people played the game, and that they didn't care about their characters and this and that. And I'm sure some people didn't, and I'm sure some people today play that way. But the idea that like somehow it was embedded in the system that nobody role played and this and that. And I was just kind of looking through the book and I saw something I thought was really interesting. So I thought I would talk about it a little bit. We'll see where this leads us. So so this is on page 34 of the Player's Handbook. Let's see if I do this. Okay, down at the bottom here, it says, establishing the character. By determining abilities, race, class, alignment, and hit points, you have, to the top here, created your character. Next, you must name him or her and possibly give some family background and a name of a next of kin as heir to the possessions if he should ever meet an untimely death. Yeah, okay. To personify the character. Having done that, your Dungeon Master will introduce your character to the campaign setting. In all likelihood, whether the locale is a village, town, or city, your character will have to acquaint himself with or herself with the territory. The first step will often be getting into the place, i.e. a gate guard demanding to know what business you have in the town or city. Thereafter, it will be necessary to locate a safe and reasonably placed place in which to lodge, typically an inn of some sort, but perhaps a rented cot, a loft, or even chambers at a hostel. Since the location selected will have to serve as a base and depot, it must be relatively safe from intrusion or burglary. Learning the lay of the land and attempt to find the trade establishment need to supply the desired equipment for adventuring. Perhaps it will also be necessary to locate where the other player characters reside in order to engage in joint expeditions. This is interesting here, right? In any event, your character created, personified, and established will be ready to adventure once equipment is purchased and relations with other player characters are settled. If player characters are not immediately available, or if they are not cooperative, it is advisable that men-at-arms will be hired. Hirelings of this sort, as well as henchmen, are detailed in the section Hirelings and Henchmen. So there's a bit to unpack here that I think is really interesting. Number one, the idea that like you shouldn't have any kind of background and not even name your character or whatever is clearly dismissed here in the Player's Handbook. They're saying to do it. But also the idea that necessarily like everybody just kind of meets in the tavern and here's an adventure. But rather each individual character needs to bring themselves into the world and figure out what's going on with themselves and how they fit in, and then seek out the other players in the campaign. Because remember, a campaign in the scope of like AD&D, or many games, it wasn't just like what you might think of now when you get like an adventure path where it's like, here's the adventure path and we're all here and we went to adventuring school and we work together. It's more like an open world, right? You can choose, like I know people talk a lot about what's called West Marches. There was a campaign called West Marches, but that's kind of the way that you did it, right? It's like your character was in this base town and you had to kind of work with the other PCs and say, hey, let's do something. I heard this rumor. Or I heard, they heard a rumor and they're looking to bring somebody in on the party. Oh, you know what? We just lost our thief. That happens a lot. So we're looking for a new one. And now this new character happens to come into town. And it does seem like it would require some extra effort to import each character individually like this, especially if you're starting fresh. But once the campaign's running, it shouldn't actually be that difficult to just import new people as we go. What's interesting here, and again, this works better in like a more like open world West Marches, the players kind of push the campaign forward format versus one like that you've got like a goal where it's like, okay, well, this is the campaign. Like, for instance, I'm running one now. It's been running for a long time. If the new person comes in, I'm not going to start having them do separate adventures. I mean, they're just going to figure out a way to join the party that's already there because that makes sense. But if you are doing a more open world campaign, and I could see this kind of thing being great for when people want to have multiple characters as well. Because you could bring in your thief character, and they might join this one group to go on an expedition, and then while they're there, you could play another day with a couple other players, or even the same players, and now your fighter character comes into town, and they meet up with some other people, and they join an expedition, and now you've got multiple characters playing in multiple different adventures in the same world. And I think that can be really, really interesting and a really kind of cool way to play. And I think that it's something that maybe people don't do as much now as it seems implied that they did back then. But the other thing this kind of reminds me of, which I think is really interesting, is that, oh man, I can't remember his name now. I'll put in the Tim Shorts. Sorry, Tim. Tim Shorts, Gothic Manor. He actually did, well, it was a while ago now, but he had a podcast where he was talking about how when he starts a new campaign, he does basically a one-on-one adventure with each of the players to bring their characters into the town. And that sounds a lot like this. And I love that. I think it's really interesting. And when I start my next big campaign, I think this is what I'm going to do. You take 1 or 2 hours with each player and you bring their character into the world. They can meet people, they can meet shopkeepers, they can make deals, they can find where they're staying. And then ultimately, they can all meet up together. This seems to imply that maybe all the player characters would always adventure together, which, I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? But, like if your character has a rumor and nobody else wants to do it, then you just hire some henchmen and go do it. And I think that changes the gameplay. I know that everybody doesn't have as many hours in the day to do all this stuff as they'd like to, but I could definitely see, having this kind of thing going on as a campaign that's kind of based out of a city. So I don't know, did anybody ever play like this? I feel like when we were kids playing, in a sense, we did this because we oftentimes did one-on-one stuff because not every kid was around all the time. So we were always doing different stuff and we played multiple characters each so we kind of did it by default. Or maybe I read it here and I just don't really remember. It's super interesting. So I'd love to know what people are doing. Are you doing this kind of stuff now? Do you introduce your characters into the campaign this way? Do you, as a DM, do you make people kind of go through the process of like buying their gear and stuff, making deals and doing all that stuff as they enter into the city? Or do you just let them, start with an adventurer's pack and a sword and then they're just with the party? Which, again, there's nothing wrong with that. This seems to be a fairly common way to start, especially for one-shots, right? But if it's an open-ended campaign, what do you think? Let me know in the comments below what you guys think. Subscribe and ring the bell if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.